Sorry. So again, when talking to John about what to present, you guys seem to be in a place where it's less me trying to convince you that blended learning, hybrid learning is a good idea. Clearly you've gotten your Teagle grant, this is something people are interested and committed to. Witness the number of people who have shown up today. And so I decided I would talk to you a little bit more about what the study that John mentioned, that first NGLC study, what we've sort of learned from that, and then from things that we've been doing since then about what we can, how we can use blended learning to improve the kinds of teaching that we do, okay? So, and I kind of call this research-based course design. In other contexts, using the word research-based really makes people salivate. You guys maybe not so much, but when I say research, what I mean is both that study, the study of blended learning in a liberal arts college environment, where we really were saying, okay, yes, there's some early research that showed that this had really positive effects on student learning, on student engagement at these very large universities where it had been studied. Would it work the same way at a small liberal arts college? And there were a couple of things you can think about. The comparison, the control courses that were part of those big studies at big places were often like 800 students or something like this. Well, yes, maybe we could see where this would have an impact when you have 800 students, anything that helps to sort of reach them. What about when you have 25, which is more along our lines? Another issue with this is a lot of the benefits that students in particular saw was that if hybrid learning or blended learning was used so the computer-based part took the place of some of the in-class time, these are all commuting students, right? They don't have to drive to campus. They don't have to find parking. They don't have to, so again, residential colleges, does that really make sense? So that was the original study, and what we found was actually, yes, our faculty, not only did we see the same kinds of learning gains that one saw in these earlier studies that were focused on large schools, but that our faculty and students, by and large, felt like this was really helping with faculty-student interaction, helping with student-student collaboration, that this was in keeping, even though it was, technology and something that maybe we're not as renowned for, it was really supportive of the sort of traditions of a liberal arts college, which is very much interpersonal, very much around faculty-student interactions. Okay, so we were a little afraid that maybe this would take us away from what we feel like we're doing. And as John mentioned, we do a conference every year. This year it'll be, I believe, May 21st and 22nd, somewhere around in there. It's generally that the third week in May. On Bryn Mawr's campus. You guys are all welcome to come. There'll be a call for papers and information coming out about the exact time and date very soon. And this is, I put our website up. You can find out more information about it here. And then I'll give this slide to Diane to share with you guys, so you'll have the link. And it really is meant to be both faculty and instructional technology staff sharing their experiences. So it's people from colleges just like ours who are talking about what they've done, what they've tried, what they've learned. And I find it just a fabulous thing. And many faculty that I talk to afterwards say, this is fabulous. I never travel someplace and talk to my colleagues about teaching, right? I always travel to do my research. And for you guys, since it's so close, I really highly recommend you check it out. So that's some of the research that I'm drawing on. The other research, though, is literature on cognitive development and memory, what's kind of called learning sciences research. This is research that came out of a couple of fields, one of which is computer science. So people trying to figure out how humans learn in order to make machines learn. Okay, so that's one thread. Psychology feeds into this. To some extent, there's a separate sort of scholarship of teaching and learning that is more sort of traditional pedagogy, looking at classrooms and things like this. So both of those as John mentioned, I'm trained as a historian, so I kind of come to this not as a education researcher, but I've come to that as I've been doing what I've been doing. So we did our study, and then I was reading a lot of this literature in cognitive development, memory, reading scholarship, teaching, and learning, and seeing some of the resonances between what we were hearing in our own study and what people were finding in this. So that's what I want to kind of combine for you today, and maybe give you some ideas about, as you think about your own sort of hybrid blended learning projects, some of the things that you can focus on so that you can really capitalize on what we know from learning science research, pedagogical research really works. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And I have to say, one thing that I'm always embarrassed about is I'm giving a very traditional lecture here. And here I am, I have tried to do a blended learning conference. It doesn't work. You can't expect conference goers to read anything before they come to class or to view anything before they come to class. So one thing I have learned, blended learning requires a consistent relationship over time, right? A one-off, not going to work. Okay, so what is blended learning, just so we're all on the same page? Anybody want to give me a definition? You haven't done your reading. Okay. Usually, definitions abound. They always involve some sort of combination of something computer-based, right, and something in class. That's typical. Where it goes from there varies a bit. In some cases, the computer-based has to take away, the expectation is that the computer-based part will be replacing some of the classroom times, right? So you're in class less often. For our study, we didn't say that anyone had to do that. Again, because we're residential colleges, so it wasn't really clear what the benefits are for that. I have to say, we are starting to think about, from a consortial level, we have, as you might know, the tri-colleges, Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore. And even though we are very, very close together, the logistics of getting students and faculty from one campus to the other does really impact students and faculty, right? They can't schedule certain courses because they've got to add in that travel time, right? The buses only run certain times, things like this. So we are starting to think, maybe reducing the amount of time that students have to spend physically in a class together and, looking at some alternatives might actually make some of these programs that are very heavily tri-college easier to connect to the rest of a student's curriculum. But anyway, when we were first starting this, we weren't necessarily thinking that it was an either or, that this would be sort of a combination of the two. And I say our old definition because one of the things that when we started this, people were like, well, my students are reading PDFs of articles online. Is that blended learning? And my provost at the time, who was sort of the initiator of this, was like, no, that's sort of where we think we are now. We really want to push the envelope. So she added, and partly because looking at some of the research on what was effective, she added this requirement that it had to, whatever was happening online, students had to be getting feedback on their learning, okay? It couldn't be they were simply watching something, reading something. They had to be, in some ways, tested or asked about what they knew and then get some sort of feedback on that, okay? And then the other requirement that we had was that the online piece had to inform the classroom piece and vice versa, right? That somehow what was going on in the classroom had to change. It wasn't that you just tacked on this online thing and the two were completely independent. So how many of you flipped your class? Yeah, so one of the things that's come out of this subsequently is I speak to a lot of people who are flipping their class, and maybe the students aren't getting feedback on their learning outside of class, but what they're doing is clearly they consider, and many other people consider, blended learning. And one of the things I noticed when I talked to faculty who were doing that, if you talk to them about why they're flipping their class, it's to put the sort of lecture type things outside of class so that whatever they're doing in class, students can get more feedback on their learning. And so one of the things we've realized is that feedback piece doesn't necessarily have to be online. I think what everybody is doing is trying to get students to have more feedback on their learning generally, right? To be more active, to think more actively. And so we've sort of rethought this. And when I say feedback on their, this was really what we were thinking of with that original grant, right? We were thinking of these kinds of online quizzes, online tutorials where students were asked questions, they put in information, and they got, you can see that little green check there, some sort of feedback on this. But even in this case, you know, this is just, yes, you got the right one, right? That's not very helpful to a student who might have been guessing, for example. And the faculty member didn't stop here. She looks at how these students are doing, and she actually talks with them. You can see the next question is, consciously or unconsciously, we identify minerals using a few key characteristics we associate with them. Name the two you were thinking. That can't be auto-graded, but she would take that information and, like, if people were, you know, let's say they were getting something incorrect quite frequently and they were putting things that wouldn't work, she would then have a conversation about, okay, you guys said, you know, it fractures in this way and it's black, you know, well, okay, that actually applies to these other things, and let's do this. So the feedback didn't stop here. She was actually incorporating this into the classroom, and there was more feedback and there was more discussion. So, revised definition, that it is something computer, something classroom, that they're both informing one another. I think that's extremely important, and students really pick up on that. And that the goals are increasing opportunities for active learning, feedback on learning, and then fostering deep learning. Okay. So, as I was, you know, sort of looking at our findings, talking about our findings, sharing our findings, I started looking around for research on why blended learning works. Okay, what is it that is effective here? And there are two hypotheses. One is that students spend more time on task. And I have a colleague at the University of Houston who is convinced that this is why blended learning is working in his class, that his students are actually doing the work for the first time. They're reading, they're doing stuff. Bryn Mawr students, you know, to hear them talk at least, it's clear that they were doing the work before, right? I'm not really convinced that this is the case in our context. And also I know that many of my faculty colleagues are really sensitive about the workloads that students have, and so they were often taking away certain types of activities, paper-based maybe, to put in the blended learning. So it wasn't that they were increasing the amount that students were doing, they were just having them do it in a different way. So I'm a little skeptical about this. The other reason I'm skeptical is if you look at the research itself, where people make this claim, it's always a self-reported claim on students' part about how much they're doing, okay? And, you know, it's not really strongly investigated in any way, you know, and it's not sort of a complex, well, what are you doing with your time, that sort of thing. So I'm less convinced about this. The other hypothesis, and this is the one that I tend to think is probably more likely, is that students are spending better time on tasks. They may also be spending more time on tasks, but the time that they are spending, whatever that amount, is effective in ways that maybe it wasn't before. And that's what I want to present to you today. Sort of here's the evidence for that. And I think one of the things that will hopefully come out of this is that this is effective because faculty are using it in ways to be effective, right? It's not, the technology isn't magic. Okay, one of our findings was we looked at students who were working in an online chemistry. So instead of doing problem sets the old way with paper, pencil, you know, and then they were handing them in, they were doing this online. Now there are some benefits, I think, to that because the students get feedback immediately. The faculty can act on that. They don't have to wait 2 weeks to, you know, finish the grading and figure out, oh wait, we didn't get this, let's go back. But, you know, the correlation we saw, and it was very clear, the more students did their work, the better they did, right? Well, that's not rocket science. I think if you were able to take a paper and pencil activities and sort of look at who did the work and who, consistently over time, you would find the more students do their homework, the better they do, right? The data is easier to show in an online context, and I think that's important because the faculty member that participated in this now shows that graph, right, and says, and we even compared it to their incoming SAT math scores to say, look, this is not genetics, if you work at this, you can, in fact, do better. But again, it's not some sort of magic that has to do with the fact that this is digital. I think it's very much that faculty are using it in very clever ways. And a key case in point is, as I said, I think most people go into blended learning in part because they're trying to get their students more involved, right? They want their students to have more active learning experiences. And a good example, and a very simple example, there's Josh Kaplan, a postdoctoral fellow at Bryn Mawr, was asked to teach a course on the biology of plants. And this is something we hadn't offered for a while. It's something he had never taught before. So there was that, he didn't have an experience, he didn't have a course sort of set up. But the other issue was, given where it sort of fell in the curriculum, it was not a lab course, okay? It was a 3-hour a week course with no lab, but he felt like it was essential for students to have that sort of hands-on lab experience. How do you do that without adding in a lab? You figure out ways to do that in class, right? And so what he did, and again, very simple, he just took some of the online resources that came with his textbook, we ported them into Moodle, and he used them to start having students do more of the sort of introductory preparatory work offline, outside of class, and then using online quizzing to see if people are getting it, to pinpoint the areas that they're not getting and talk about those in, say, 1 or 2 class periods a week, and then have the other class periods for this hands-on sort of research-based exploration. And I see this again and again. I see this with folks who are flipping. I see this with folks who are trying to hope that, not just hope, but really sort of help encourage, what have you, students to get more out of the reading so that they have to spend less time lecturing, things like this, right? And you guys probably know, but research has shown that active learning does improve students' learning, right? That's me sitting here telling you all of this is not really going to do much. If I were to tell you and then quiz you, or tell you and have you discuss, which is what will happen hopefully after this, that's where the real sort of learning comes. So my second sort of exhibit in this argument to put forward my case is the increased opportunities for formative assessment that often come with blended learning, and that faculty are using blended learning to do this, essentially. So what is formative assessment? Quiz? Brave people? Yes? No? Okay, okay. Ongoing assessments, yeah. Other aspects? Huh? Check for understanding, yeah. So it's the comparison, or the thing that you're against when you say formative assessment is summative assessment, where you're trying to give students a grade. You're marking how much they got, right? Formative assessment is for sort of how much did you get, let's help you get more, right? And so that might be, it's assessment where the gathering evidence is in order to improve student learning, okay? And that could be at the student level. So, okay, here's where you looks like you are. Let's work on these areas that you're not getting so much. But it's also used to talk about this kind of gathering evidence about student learning to improve courses, to improve programs, to improve departments. Okay, so thinking about, ooh, it looks like all of our students are having issues in this. Maybe we need to focus on that, right? Either at the course level or at the department level. And to give you an example of how this happens sort of in the blended learning things that I see. This is from a online tutorial to help students conceptually prepare for a lab. This was created by a faculty member who noticed that the students would come in, she had them doing stuff that helped them prepare procedurally, and if during the lab you asked them what they were doing, they could explain, I'm doing this, and then I'm doing this, and then I'm doing this, and then I'm putting the stuff in this bowl, you know, that sort of thing. But if you asked them from a chemistry standpoint, what are you doing, they couldn't say. So here, they've been asked what the mass percent of Fe is in a particular compound. First, they have to understand what is mass percent Fe, and so that's the question that they've been asked. So in here, the top one, they've given a wrong answer, and you can see not only are they told, no, that's wrong, but they're sort of given an explanation. And then they click on continue, and they go to this mass percent review, right, where they sort of walk through that concept. Once they've gotten that concept, then they move on to the next thing. Okay, how do we calculate it, right? Here's an example of data that faculty get back. On the ones on the left side is at the individual question level how students were doing. So the green bars are students that got it right. The red bars are wrong choices that students make. And then I think the right side is the sort of dashboard that you drill down to get to those two things. Here's another example of, this was that quiz that I showed you. If I scroll down a little further in the same window, this is what the faculty member is seeing. So you see this student put in sillimanite and got that right. But it took her all the way down to 10 before she got sillimanite. Okay, there were 10 possibilities here. So, yeah, that tells you something very different, right? She doesn't have a clue. And for faculty, I think this data really informs how they're teaching. And the faculty that I know that have experimented with this and are sticking with it, it is this sort of data that they get back, this snapshot of sort of where students are, that they find really, really, really valuable. And in a couple of levels, one, it allows them to teach more agilely. So we have one faculty member who has a very long commute by train, and he essentially has his students do exercises like this online. They're due, I think he has to do it like 3 a.m., and he gets up at 6 and he's on the train with his laptop and he's looking over how they do, and what he does in the next class is very much dependent on where they seem to be, okay? So this lets faculty really have a sense, and sooner than you would if you were doing paper-based assignments that the faculty has to grade, of where students are, what they're thinking. And again, we'll get into metacognition in a second, but if you're asking questions about why did you think this, that also gives you data that you might not have if you just have people checking off boxes about what's right, what's wrong, what you think is right, what you think is wrong. The other thing that I think faculty in introductory courses, we noticed, were particularly interested in experimenting with this, and part of the reason when I talked to them was they faced a lot of unknowns, right? If your students are coming out of History 101 with John down the hall, I know exactly what John teaches, and so I have a sense of what they know, right? If they're coming from all these different schools, now from all over the world, we have a much greater diversity in terms of background than we have in the past. We don't know how, in many cases, a particular curriculum is being taught in a different country, for example. So I think this kind of snapshot becomes more important when you know less about where your students are. You can't assume as much as you maybe could in the past. And it also helps faculty find students who are struggling, or find students who clearly are in the wrong course because they know all this stuff, something like this, and really give them either additional challenge or additional support. For the students, they reported, and the students picked up on this, and it's interesting, students never use the term mastery, okay? Faculty were often using this in low stakes. These were low stakes assignments. The students were told, you get credit for completing it, but it's really all about you figuring this stuff out and me figuring out where there are issues so that I can help you guys figure this stuff out. That was kind of the message that was getting. And students picked up on this, and they really liked the idea of being able to practice and get feedback before it counted, right? That's what they would say. They felt this helped them better structure study time. They could focus on areas they knew that they had difficulty with. They could get help before you moved on to a different topic, which was really important. But both they and faculty noticed, and this is where the tie to, I think, the liberal arts way of doing things, that this enabled them to ask much better questions. So they were coming into class, or they were coming into office hours. You know, the chemistry professor that participated in this talked about his students often come in saying, oh, you know, I can't do science. It's just, chemistry, you know, I just don't get it. Now they were coming in saying, so I was with you right up until covalent bonds, and now I'm a little fuzzy, you know, could we go back over that? So it was less the sort of, they were able to ask more leading questions, more informed questions, and he in turn was able to give more informed answers. The other thing he noticed was he was really able to tease out which students weren't putting in as much work maybe as their peers, right, and didn't, as freshmen, he teaches a freshman course, didn't perhaps know how much work was expected in college. And you know, there are many kids who have chemistry in high school, and you kind of scratch the surface. And so, you know, they get into the college course, and the first 6 weeks or so, they're golden, you know, everything's great, and then suddenly they crash. And it's because you're moving more in depth. Many of them, however, interpret this as, I can't do science. And for Bryn Mawr, which really prides itself on creating women scientists, this is where we want to catch them, right? And he was being able to say, okay, you know, you're not really working as hard as most people are spending about this much time, which he could tell by tracking the stuff, was really helpful, versus, okay, I see you're working really, really hard and clearly you're not getting something. Let's see what we can, you know, if we can figure out where it is. Is it a math issue? Is it a conceptual issue? Is it a language issue? Things like this. So, and again, keep in mind that the way we framed our study, we were requiring people to build in some of this quizzing and feedback. So yes, of course, our faculty were using it for formative assessment, right? We sort of insisted on that. But one of the reasons why, if you look at the learning science, the sort of reasons why formative assessment is so valuable, okay, some of it's neurological, as we shall see. So there's a concept called retrieval practice, okay? It's the act of recalling information. And you might have heard this, I've seen New York Times articles about this periodically called the testing effect. How many people have seen the testing effect? Yes, nodding, hands, okay. Yeah, it's this idea that if you're tested on something, if you're asked to sort of dredge through your memory and recall some stuff, that it actually strengthens the neural connections formed around that information. And there are lots and lots of sort of laboratory-style studies that have shown that this kind of testing, or again, retrieval practice, because I think when you say testing, people think of the SAT, right, which is not necessarily what we're talking about. It could be, I ask you to explain what you just read, you know, or something like that. That's retrieval practice as well. But that testing not only improves sort of retention, so if you give people vocabulary sheets and you quiz them a few minutes later, you know, they will remember that vocabulary better than if you didn't quiz them. But also sort of the higher order type thinking, so how people are organizing the knowledge that they give. It helps them when they then go back and learn the next step, right? So it's not just a one-time thing. And students or people who have been given these sort of retrieval practice testing interventions are better able to apply information, which is really what we want people to do, right? It's not just that they can memorize the facts, it's that they're actually able to use them in ways. And what's really weird is if you have a certain swath of material and you can only ask questions about, some subset of that, people do better on the subset you didn't ask them about, which is very interesting. So going back to the stuff that you learned in a particular context, it's actually strengthening connections about all of those things, not just the ones that you're being specifically asked on. Now, you know, these are marked, okay, in this laboratory studies, but especially when you compare them to what students usually do. Highlighting is a big one, right? Usually students to study, they're actually rereading notes, rereading over the books where they've highlighted. So the problem with highlighting, they've done some studies, it actually has a negative correlation with how well students do. And part of that is when you're reading something for the first time, you have no idea what's important. So if you look at a book, and I've gone back to, you know, I recently helped my parents move, and I found some old books that I hadn't. I've got, like, you know, whole pages highlighted or whatever. So another one that I think we tend to be more in tune with is something like concept mapping, right? Concept mapping does show gains in helping students sort of organize knowledge, but not nearly to the extent that the retrieval practice did. So all of this to say that retrieval practice, testing, being asked to think about, rephrase, summarize, whatever, something that you've learned actually creates new learning. You learn in the process of doing that, okay? And there are some other things that I think are very relevant to the way that we're using blended learning in the class, and that is all of the things that I've just been telling you about the cognitive benefits. This comes even if students never get any feedback, okay? It's the mental act of recalling, but the feedback has been shown to be valuable as well, in that, as we would expect, it helps students catch and correct misperceptions. So one problem with retrieval practice, if you're not getting feedback, you might retrieve something erroneously and then it gets stuck, right? So catching those moments and saying, no, actually, look at it again is important for that. But the other really important role of feedback we've discovered, researchers have discovered, is that it strengthens those low confident answers that were actually correct, so the guesses. And this actually came out in the surveys and things that we did with students in our pilot courses, where they would say, you know, it's really nice that I know immediately what I did, but you've really got to tell me why I'm right, because I was guessing, you know, I have no idea. So that is actually almost as important as correcting wrong answers, as it turns out.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The example you were giving before for the student went through 10 minerals before getting silver, that you're really saying that that helped?
Well, keep in mind that that was not all, right? That the faculty member looks at that and says, okay, we're going to spend some time on this, you know, and if everybody is doing this, maybe we spend a class on, I've noticed you guys are having a lot of difficulty with these minerals. If it's that student who's consistently doing that for lots of things, the faculty member is calling that person in and saying, hey, what's going on here, you know? So maybe not in the cognitive way at that particular moment, but I think as formative assessment, yes, if that makes sense.
I can understand it as an assessment procedure for the faculty member, but I have difficulty believing that any neural cognitive connection is made when you guess 10 times to get the right answer.
Right. I think that's true, although I do think that that student now knows that she doesn't really know what sillimanite is, and that's important, right? As we'll see. Yeah.
To put the sillimanite example in the context of the combo, what is this and what was your heuristic?
What was what? Sorry.
What was your heuristic for categorizing it? Like, how were you identifying this?
Right.
Combo? Again, just wondering about the instruction, but also could help the student realize, I don't know what sillimanite is, and I don't know how to approach this at all. I don't have the schema.
Right.
I'd rather have a student say that it was, what did you say, elongated array.
Right.
I'd rather a student say, I had no idea.
Right.
Well, they basically have said that.
Right, exactly. And that's what I'm saying, yeah.
But I'd rather have a student be
Right.
But I guess.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, some students might say that, but it's clear to everyone, certainly, that the student guessed, right? Both to her at this point and I think to the faculty
My
member.
question was really with these neural connections.
Right.
I find it
Right.
hard to believe that is studying.
Yes.
I think it's broken.
Yeah.
And this is a single student. I know that example.
Yeah. And we'll get on to metacognition, and that's where I think this, you know, sort of the broken neural connection question gets. But it is a concern, and it is a reason why I think many people are very hesitant to do only sort of multiple choice quizzing, because you're not sure what's being reinforced, right? Another thing about multiple choice quizzing that can be tricky is, depending on how the questions are made, it could be testing whether or not someone recalls seeing something versus actually understanding it, right? Oh yes, I remember this phrase in the book, or oh yes, I remember you mentioned this word, right? So you have to be careful, definitely. The other sort of, I think, that's not inherent in retrieval practice, but in the way that faculty are using it, there is a cognitive benefit when you space learning over time. So if I were to quiz you guys today on what I've said here, you would understand it better than if I didn't quiz you. But on the other hand, you just heard it, so you'll probably do pretty well, right? If I were to quiz you 2 weeks from now, and you hadn't had a chance to practice or something, you probably would do a lot worse. And part of, you know, our ways of assessing students are often geared towards that short-term assessment. And studies have shown it's really important to keep kind of coming back to certain things. Now, in some fields, there's no way to, like, for example, language learning, there's no way to forget the nouns when you move on to the verbs, right? So you're constantly reinforcing the material that you've already learned. In other subjects, the way that we sort of create the courses, for example, if I'm teaching history, and a very important concept is liberalism. I teach sort of 19th, 20th century. Liberalism in Europe in the 19th century is very different from liberalism in the US in the 20th century. And one of the things that I've discovered is I can't just say that once. I can't even have my students articulate that once. We have to constantly, over the course of the semester, come up with the idea, aha, liberalism is not the same as liberalism today. You know, otherwise it's just not going to sink in. It's not going to take the place of the liberalism they know and love. And so I'll get papers back at the end where they think liberalism is 20th century liberalism, the Democrats, you know, or whatever, the Democrat Party. But the other thing that's interesting about this, and students, again, in our surveys recognize this, students also get into crisis mode at some point, and they're, you know, putting out fires. One of my early mentors in teaching said his best advice for me was, you got to keep on their radar every week, right? And especially in history, we tend to have courses where you're reading, and then you do a paper, and you're reading, and you do a paper. He said the students aren't going to read unless, you know, because they have some high stakes assignment that's due that same week. And of course, they're going to put off the reading because they can catch up later, right? You need to somehow build in this, you know, check in with me about what you're doing over time. And the students recognize this. And one of the things that they liked actually about the online pieces was that it forced them to, you know, digest the reading. It forced them to sit back and take stock periodically rather than waiting until the very end. And research shows that doing that is actually better than waiting till the very end. So the last thing, and this more so than anything else maybe, is an example where it's how faculty are using this, not necessarily the thing itself, that is powerful. And that is the support that it can give for metacognitive thinking and for helping students to develop metacognitive thinking. Okay, so metacognition, what is it? Metacognition is thinking about thinking, right? Thinking about what you're doing. The idea about the importance of metacognition comes out of research where people are looking at expert learners and looking at novice learners and trying to figure out how to get novices to that expert point. And one of the things that people noticed is that expert learners have really good metacognition. They're really good at figuring out, what is it I know? What is it I don't know? How do I get what I need to know? And sort of assessing, okay, here's the process I'm going through to get what I need to know. Is it working? Okay. Novices were terrible about this. The problem is we're usually novices, okay, in any field. I might be great at this technology stuff, and one of the reasons I'm great at this technology stuff is that I know how to find information that I need. I know what I don't understand. I know enough about the terminology and things like that to know, what I don't get and where to go and find that information. I know enough about the field. That's what makes me an expert. It's not that I know everything about technology. What makes people that I work with novices is that they don't know those things, okay? And what we've seen, and I've sort of hinted at it in some of these examples, is faculty building in these sort of metacognitive assessments into their courses through online materials. So an example from that quiz was asking the students not only, what do you think this mineral is, but, and I should say that course, it's mineralogy and crystal chemistry. It is the course that geology majors have to take when they decide to major. It is about learning to identify minerals in the field and under a microscope in cross-section. So it is actually, the skill that you need to develop is being able to pick up a rock and say, this has such and such in it, right? So it's not just that, it makes more sense when you know that, I think. But asking them, why did you think this? Here's some other examples. I think on the left, same course, the faculty member periodically gave her, she called these IFPs, which was, the P is practice, feedback is the F. I can't remember what the I stands for, but that's what she called her little quizzes. And there she's asking them how easy were these, and she kind of gives them the pictures that they looked at. And that was twofold, actually. Because these were new, she was finding out, first of all, whether the pictures were any good, right? You can change the angle, change the lighting, and this could be important. But it also sort of helped her determine, what do we need to spend more time on? She also configured this course. Typically, mineralogy, you focus on a subset of minerals with similar characteristics, and then you move on to the next subset of minerals with similar characteristics, and then you move on to the next subset, so that by the time you get to the midterm, you may not have ever seen the minerals from the first set again, right? The way she structured the course was she first focused on the most common minerals that students will see, okay? No similar characteristics necessarily. And then those minerals kept popping up in the quizzes all the way through the year, just as they would when students are in the field. Okay, so she really helped them sort of, she used these quizzes to kind of mirror the way the real world application that students would be using for this. I forgot where I was going with that. But anyway, so polling about activities and assessments, right? This sort of idea about how easy is this? Oh yes, that knowing that they were still struggling with this one particular thing meant that as she moved forward, she kept putting that thing right into the practices. So those polls served that. And I should say, I don't think I mentioned this, but all of these things were done in Moodle. So if you guys use Moodle, if you use Blackboard, if you use other things, probably have the same functionality. She's using quizzes, and she's using a questionnaire feature, which is essentially a quiz that's anonymous. Okay, those are the two things that she's using. She also did these self-assessments where, and it's a little hard to read, but here she's asking students to rate, how confident are you that you can distinguish the following minerals from each other? So she has calcite versus quartz, amphibole versus pyroxene or something like this, feldspar versus this. Again, over time, she has observed people have difficulty with these, right? Or her particular students in this particular version of the course have difficulty with these. So she's checking in, and she's getting them, even more importantly, she's getting them to check in with themselves and think, how good am I at distinguishing between these two things? And keep in mind, this is not the only feedback, right? In class, they're discussing these things too. So it's not just that this is in a vacuum. The second question on that right-hand side, she says, how confident are you that you can identify each of these properties? And then she goes through the kinds of things that you think about when you're trying to identify a mineral, like cleavage, fracture, parting, striations, color, these sorts of things. Okay, so again, how are you doing with this sort of building these skills? Another example I've seen, some of you might use classroom assessment techniques. I think they're sometimes called CATs, where the minute paper, where you have students sort of take a break in the lecture and say, okay, what is it that, summarize within a quick paper, or muddiest point, what was the most confusing thing of what we've been talking about. There is an online version of these called Student Assessment of Their Learning Gains, and it's really designed to help students sort of think metacognitively about what they've been getting and not getting. And I've seen a lot of faculty incorporate these into courses in various parts. And sometimes this is to get students to think about online things, but a lot of times it's to get them to think about in-class stuff. And then again, it's brought back into class where the class discusses sort of what they found, or the faculty member can say, interestingly enough, you guys all think you're very good at X, but when I look at your quizzes, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. So let's talk about that, right? So a lot of these things are opportunities for teaching moments, basically, creating opportunities for teaching moments. Okay, to sum up, I think the reason that we have seen blended learning be helpful in terms of increasing student learning, supporting student learning, is in part because faculty have been using it to help students spend better time on task. Okay, so they're getting more out of the work that they're doing outside of the classroom as well as the work that they're doing inside of the classroom. And in a couple of ways. One, as I said, a lot of the reason that people go into something like this is in order to get out of purely lecture mode. So they're trying to build in more opportunities for active learning, and that we know is good, right? So even just that, I think, is important. But also a lot of these things, and the other thing I think is funny about folks that I've worked with who are flipping the class is a lot of, so they start out, they record some lectures, or they record some mini lectures usually, but then they say, well, how do I know they're watching them? And yes, I can see, okay, they accessed it, or maybe I can even see they watched it from start to finish, but with our little system that we use, you can actually watch it from start to finish on 3 times the speed, so are they really getting it? So the next thing they do is they build a couple little quizzes, that ask students, are you getting it? So again, these opportunities for sort of formative assessment, I think, is something that faculty tend to use blended learning for. And in part because where you can do things that are auto-graded, you can do more assessment than you could if you have a 60-person class, right? If you were having to hand grade everything. And one of the things about liberal arts colleges, we don't have large graduate programs, ergo we have no gradiers, right? Another thing I would say is even when you can't auto-grade something, you can ask students to give you a really quick short answer explanation of something, and you can look over those short answers briefly before you go into class and say, okay, here's what I think you guys think about X. Or, you guys seem to think that this is, what this is. You guys seem to think of that is what this is. I want you guys to get together in whatever group you're in and try to convince the other side that you're, I'm not going to tell you which of you is right. We're going to figure this out, So there's creative ways of using that, things that can't be auto-graded, but that are a lot faster than taking all of the paper things, getting them in, having the students get them to you, that sort of thing. By increasing the amount of formative assessment, we are also, perhaps without thinking it, but sometimes very consciously, right, building on the cognitive benefits of retrieval practice, particularly when we're giving student feedback, and particularly when we're using this to space learning out over time and to have students review old material periodically. And then the other thing is, many faculty are using, phrasing questions in such a way or building in specific moments where they're asking students to think about what they know. There was a very interesting, I can't remember which textbook company, they were really pushing this adaptive learning thing that they had, and I saw a demo that they did, and the big thing was for every question, they asked students not only, what do you think is the right answer? These are just basic multiple choice questions, and they're not really all that great, the questions themselves. But they would ask the students, how confident are you? And then there was a dashboard that showed students, and this is, it's not much, but it does give you a little bit more information in the sense that if you're really confident about answers that are wrong, that's very different than being about answers that are wrong, and it's very different than being about answers that are actually right? So it's, again, giving the students a little bit more information about what they're learning. Okay? So, questions? Yes?
One thing that I take away from all this is that what you've been talking about really shows how this goes well into the quiz and exam type of pipeline. How does this kind of blended learning work into, say, students doing independent projects, either individual or in group, or into writing, like you say, in history? I'm in English, so we do the reading paper cycle as well. I've actually never given an exam in the 7+ years I've been at my school. So how does this apply to those kind of scenarios?
Yeah, I grapple with the same thing because a lot of the courses that I teach, there are no exams. I don't actually test students. It has made me rethink that. And again, for things like the liberalism issue, right? I realized that part of the reason that they weren't getting it was because I wasn't making them sort of rethink that periodically, right? And articulate that explicitly. So maybe actually quizzing them occasionally on what liberalism actually is, would help with those kinds of things. So, and I work with a woman in art history who also did a pedagogical workshop with science faculty and realized that in art history, there was a lot of background information and materials that she expected her students to master, but she never quizzed them, right? And the sort of expertise in being able to evaluate something is in some ways the same as the expertise in being able to understand a chemical equation, and maybe I should actually be quizzing students on what a Gothic arch is. Another example, she had them go out and get examples of things. She realized that her students were really good at, if there was an illustrative example in a book of a Gothic arch, for example, they could identify, they could pick that out, right? Or if they had found some examples of a Gothic arch, they could pick those out. But if you showed them a new Gothic arch, they, 50-50. So maybe we can learn something. Maybe we could be quizzing a little bit more. So there's that. The other thing, though, I realized was that the way I was trying to teach or help students with their writing, teach students to write, was not working very well, and to think historically. Because we do a paper, I give them feedback on that paper. We do another paper, they'd make the same mistakes. I'd give them feedback on that paper. We do a final paper, and I did some workshopping, and that helped because they're getting feedback not only from me but from other people, so it's not just some weird Jenny idiosyncrasies that, I'm asking you to have a thesis because I'm strange, Everybody would really appreciate it if you have a thesis and state it clearly. I did actually have that moment, which was kind of funny. This one student I worked with, she was just like, okay. But anyway, the other thing I realized was that there were I needed to unpack a lot of what I was doing and have a moment where we focused on writing a thesis, or have a moment where we focused on evaluating evidence. And so breaking those down into little mini exercises, and maybe it's not that the students are actually doing a quiz, but one of the things that I will have students do is a more focused exercise where we're focusing on sort of one component of historical inquiry and writing, and they're putting in little maybe 3-paragraph essays, and then Moodle actually has a workshop function, which is peer review. So they're reading each other's essays, and I can give them more feedback on their essays, and I can give them feedback that's not just, little line editing or something, but sort of holistically, I see all of you doing this, or I see, these different ways of approaching that. Let's talk about it. Much more easily when I'm looking at, one-page papers or whatever. So I've found myself changing how I teach, even though I'm not maybe doing multiple choice quizzes or something like that. So I think that's the thing. I think it forces us to think, well, wait a minute, what is it that we're trying to do, and is there a way that we could do it better? If that makes sense. I also happen to know a guy up in Smith, Nick Horton, who teaches statistics, and one of the things that really annoys him about the statistics packages is that it's all problem, multiple choice, this sort of thing, and he really sees the value of open-ended questioning. So he gives his students a lot of additional open-ended questions that don't get auto-graded, but that he's looking over to see where people are, and that he's, doing the discussion of that in class. So I think the other thing is, in cases where the responses can't be auto-graded, the feedback comes in different ways. People usually do a lot more discussing about, homework in class, or there's more peer review, that sort of thing. Other questions? Time? Okay. All right, well, thank you guys. So when you get the slides, I have some references, and then also I have my contact information if you want. Okay?